The relation between Christianity and the liberal arts begs investigation from several perspectives. The historically descriptive question asks, how in the past have Christianity and the liberal arts been related to one another? The normative or prescriptive question wonders, how ought Christianity and the liberal arts properly relate to one another, if at all? And this may place before us the philosophically anthropological and the theological inquiries which ask us to contemplate, what do human nature and Christian orthodoxy require of the liberal arts for these arts to be truly liberal? And the prophetic or predictive question seeks to know what will be the relationship between Christianity and the liberal arts tomorrow. No doubt this list of questions could be extended or modified considerably, but even these cannot be exhausted in our context. So rather than attempting to do so, I will skate to and fro between them, offering reflections and musings that might prove fruitful for further discussion and deliberation. In the end, however, I want to suggest a description of the relationship between Christianity and the liberal education in which the Christianity is authentic and the education properly liberal. First, however, permit a few assertions to make explicit the perspective from which my comments proceed. Two related questions claim priority. They are, is Christianity true? And what is man? Answers to these necessarily determine the trajectory of these comments and thereby condition their end. On the first, I stand with the Oxford student of C.S. Lewis, a man called Christopher Derrick, who published a slim volume back in 1977 called Escape from Skepticism, Liberal Education as if Truth Mattered. Derrick affirmed that the Christian faith is true, and moreover, that its claim to truth is universal. That is, that its dogmas apply not only to Christians, but to all mankind. Although I am quite confident that such a claim is not the least bit controversial in this gathering, in many circles, this assertion of Christianity's universal truth would be regarded as scandalous. Derrick knew this. He acknowledged and rejected the relativist agnosticism, which reduces religious doctrine to subjective feeling, void of truth value. Permit me to read from him briefly. Some maintain that no question of truth or falsity arises in connection with doctrinal statements. These, they say, are merely verbalizations of religious experience, valid for those concerned, interesting for others, but equally misinterpreted by the man who asserts them as truth and the man who denies them as falsehood. To the contrary, Derrick said, what the church primarily offers is the objective way and truth and life of Christ. And in our present context of education, our emphasis must be on truth. Quite famously, John Henry Newman also defended theology as a branch of knowledge, and he repudiated as a form of infidelity all positions that deny to religious doctrine the status of knowledge. Religious doctrine is knowledge, he wrote in The Idea of a University, in as full a sense as Newton's doctrine is knowledge. University teaching without theology is simply unphilosophical. Theology has at least a right to claim a place there as astronomy, end quote. I will not detain us further by rehearsing Newman's line of argumentation. My point, that which I assert as a premise to this discussion, is that Christianity is not just one of so many interesting and subjectively legitimate perspectives or lifestyles from which one may freely choose or abstain altogether with impunity, much as one may treat the dessert table at a restaurant buffet. That is, I contend that the tenets of the Christian faith, tenets well expressed in the great ecumenical creeds, are true, and that among these tenets is the claim to Catholic application, that is universal. This affirmation shapes the scope of my inquiry and raises this question: what, assuming the universal truth of Christianity, is the relationship between Christianity and the liberal arts. For if Christianity's truth is universal, then we must expect that it will extend to the sphere of influence and extend its influence to the enterprise of education. Christian doctrine, of course, has something to say in answer to my second leading question, what is man? The Christian answers that man holds a privileged position amongst God's creatures, namely that man bears the image of God, something grander even than the rational soul that Aristotle specified as the distinguishing mark of Homo sapiens. The materialist vision that dominates contemporary education at all levels rejects this Christian anthropology. In his book, The Politics of Prudence, the scholar Russell Kirk described the standard materialist answer to the question, what is man? Men and women, he said, are naked apes merely, who live for the sake of production and consumption merely, for whom happiness is the gratification of sensual impulses, and to whom notions of the resurrection of the flesh and life everlasting are superstitions of the childhood of the race. The Baltimore journalist 100 years ago, H.L. Mencken, put it more eloquently and colorfully. He said, all human beings are nothing but a parade of miserable and ridiculous, rapidly disintegrating amino acids. Surely, if this materialist view is correct, there will be implications for education. Among them, education would be entirely servile, not liberal. For if at the end of the day man is merely a member of the animal kingdom and no more, then those things for the sake of which he pursues learning will again and again terminate in the gratification of his fleshly, worldly desires and needs. He will seek knowledge as a means to power and not as an end worthy in itself. Consider C.S. Lewis on this. For wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, said Lewis. And the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of man. The solution is technique. And both, in practice and technique, magic and modern technology and science, are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead, or in our day, drugging and mutilating children in the name of gender affirmation. I will return to this comparison of servile and liberal knowledge, but for now I wish to emphasize that the educational goals will be determined in no small part by the vision of human nature we embrace. What man needs educationally will be determined by what he is. I am reminded in this context of a remark by Richard Weaver in his book, Ideas Have Consequences. He wrote that all hinges on the interpretation of needs. If the primary need of man is to perfect his spiritual being and prepare for immortality, the education of the mind and the passions will take precedence over all else. Those who maintain, on the other hand, that education should prepare one for living successfully just in this world, believe that education must be such as will enable one to acquire enough wealth to live on the plane of the bourgeoisie. Now, I'm rejecting neither the enjoyment of creature comforts nor the practical learning necessary to secure them. I do reject, however, the vision of man that equates the good life, the happy life, with mere material gratification. Christianity does not permit this to masquerade as the beatific vision. Nevertheless, it is the vision of man that has warped and twisted many schools and colleges into machines for the production of pleasure-seeking pleasure producers. This is a tortured vision of man and his life. Since he is more than a beast, he requires more than pleasure to be satisfied. Decades ago, in his excellent, now famous treatise on education called Norms and Nobility, David Hicks explained why. Pleasure demands a never-ending list of luxurious accessories, the acquisition of which wears man down with work and worry. In the end, the pleasure seeker becomes preoccupied with what he lacks to complete his picture of happiness. Gratification never catches up with desire, and consumption consumes the consumer. So I begin then from the position that the claims of Christianity are true, that they extend to all men, who are by virtue of their creaturely status they're much more than highly evolved pleasure seekers. This is not enough, though. If men are more than beasts, they are still less than angels and gods. So teaches every thoughtful mind of the Western tradition. Lying between the merely material or the purely spiritual, man, in the words of Sir Thomas Browne, is the great and true amphibium, that piece between a corporal and spiritual essence. What implications, then, do these views of Christianity and of man hold for liberal education? Several. To explore these, however, requires prior inquiry into the nature of liberal education itself. What is liberal education? What are the liberal arts? Many answers have been given. Permit me to quote a few of them. The political philosopher Leo Strauss asserted that liberal education is education in culture and toward culture. One of his students has asserted that liberal education is the study of ends, of the things for the sake of which choices are made and lives are lived. In a very recent book published last year called The Death of Learning: How American Education Has Failed Our Students and What to Do About It, John Agresto explains the liberal arts as, quote, the seeking of knowledge about important matters through reason and reflection, not minor matters, not slight matters, but significant issues of human concern, and learning about them not through mere training, through mere obedience, not through repeating the thoughts and views of others, but through our thinking, our imagining, and our serious reflection. The Thomist philosopher Joseph Pieper asserted more briefly that liberal arts are the ways of human action which have their justification in themselves. The philosopher Michael Oakeshott urged that liberal learning is learning to respond to the invitations of the great intellectual adventures in which human beings have come to display their various understandings of the world and of themselves. And Mark Van Doren told us that the liberal arts are the maturing rituals of our civilized tribe. And finally, John Henry Newman famously insisted that liberal education is the cultivation of the intellect, the process of training by which the intellect, instead of being formed or sacrificed to some particular or accidental purpose, some specific trade or profession or study or science, is disciplined for its own sake, for the perception of its own proper object, for its own highest culture. With all these candidates, and believe me, there are more, do we despair with the Oxford scholar, Mr. Tracy Simmons, and agree with his suggestion that liberal education means today whatever we wish it to mean in all our idealistic and disputatious moods? Not exactly. The fact that this great thing called liberal education has been viewed from many angles and described in different terms does not render it without qualities. Permit me, therefore, to take up a few of these qualities, especially those of relevance to our task of relating the liberal arts to Christianity. Perhaps the Greek word skole, which means leisure, rest, or ease, offers a fitting point of departure. It is significant that our English word school derives from the Greek word for leisure. Leisure is the activity of the free man, the man who has shed his servile obligations. I'll have more to say about this, but when I use the word servile, don't assume that I'm using it in a negative, judgmental, or pejorative way. Servile simply means those activities that are done for the sake of something other than that activity. So it would be a servile activity to use the toilet plunger on a clogged toilet or to fix a roof leak. These are good and important things, necessary, but we don't just do them because they're fun. And leisure, on the other hand, is not to be equated with just doing nothing or anything at all. In fact, that kind of hurry-scurry when you're bored leads to the deadly sin of sloth. Leisure is something altogether different. It's an activity associated with freedom. On this subject of leisure, I commend to you all Joseph Pieper's little book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. The comparable Greek adjective for the word free is eleutherios. The Latin is liberalis. The implication is that the liberal arts are the arts of the free man with leisure. But what exactly does this mean? Here I turn to C.S. Lewis, whose curious but very helpful little book called Studies in Words contains a chapter entitled Free. There he explains just how eleutherios and liberalis, two important words, signified virtues and occupations of a free man. Lewis notes that the Greek philosopher Xenophon had an observation regarding Hellenic culture, that the Athenians have a square, the agora, called the free square, the eleutheria square, from which the tradespeople and their noises and vulgarities, which were called aperokalia, are all excluded. Lewis explains the tradespeople need not be and probably are not slaves, but they are engaged in activity which has no value except insofar as they contribute to something outside themselves. Thus, their lives are servile rather than free. The suggestion is that liberal arts are those arts not pursued for the sake of some end outside themselves, but for their own sake. In the Rhetoric, Aristotle extends this distinction between free and servile activities to free and servile possessions. Those possessions which yield some profit are the most useful, asserts Aristotle. But those which exist only to be enjoyed are eleutheria, free. Only the economically and legally free man is likely to have a piano or a library or the leisure to use them, explains Lewis. That is how one's piano or library is more liberal, more characteristic of one's position as a free man than one's coal shovel or one's tools. But this separation of useful activities and things from enjoyable activities and things does not exhaust the distinction between the servile and the liberal. If it did, one might take the impression that the liberal arts are any randomly selected diversions, be they beer drinking, book reading, belly dancing, or bowling, pursued according to one's disordered whims, from which enjoyment may be derived whenever the shoveling is finished and the tools put away. But for human beings, Aristotle insisted, some activities are more liberal than others. It is not the case that the genuinely free man will be free to do just anything. Rather, his life will be subjected to an order. And it's acquiring that order that is a big part of the process of education. Augustine recognized this, Plato recognized this. It's a turning of the soul, first to recognize that which is good and true and beautiful, and next to, as much as one might resist, come actually to love that which is good and true and beautiful, not just recognize the real thing. As Lewis once said elsewhere, and I paraphrase, it's the nature of man as he lives to love. The question isn't whether he will love things, call them good or true or beautiful for him. The question is whether he will attach his affections to the right things in the right way. That ordering of the soul so that one is free to love as one ought is the business of this educational enterprise. Aristotle explains in the Nicomachean Ethics why some activities are more liberal than others. He opens with his assertion that every art, every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. The good at which beer drinking, belly dancing, bowling, all aim is pleasure. A good perhaps, but not the highest good, either for the Christian, as we have noted, or even for Aristotle, who argued that pleasure was not pursued for its own sake, but for the sake of something else. That something else, which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else, Aristotle called happiness. Rejecting the equation of happiness with pleasure, Aristotle argued in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics that happiness is an activity in accordance with the highest human excellence. That activity Aristotle calls contemplation. And this activity alone, explains Aristotle, would seem to be loved for its own sake, not for nothing arises from it apart from the contemplating. He continues by contrasting contemplation with political and military activity, which, despite their nobility and greatness, are unleisurely and aim at ends beyond themselves. But the activity of the intellect, which is contemplative, explains Aristotle, is superior in worth for its self-sufficiency, leisureliness, unweariedness, for it aims at no end beyond itself. Now, as one trained in the history of science, I confess that that part of Aristotle's work with which I have greatest familiarity is his cosmology. But here, too, the activity of contemplation finds peculiar locus in his grand scheme. Contemplation for Aristotle is heavenly. Its fullest and most perfect demonstration is offered by Aristotle's unmoved mover, whose divine activity is contemplation of a kind attainable only by pure intellect. Another related important aspect of Aristotelian cosmology is the radical distinction he draws between the heavens above and what he calls the sublunar region below. That is, the region in Aristotle's earth-centered cosmology between the center of the earth and the sphere of the moon, which orbits the earth most closely. The immutable heavens above the moon conform flawlessly to perfection, revealing divine order for Aristotle. Things below, however, are contingent, random, subject to change and mutation and disorder. Man inhabits this lower region, but when his soul is ordered by right reason, he strives for the heavens. C.S. Lewis rightly saw this parallel between Aristotle's cosmology and his understanding of liberal activity as an activity ordered toward a higher excellence. Consider Lewis on this. The free life is to the servile life as the life of the gods, that is, the motions of the heavens, is to that of terrestrial creatures. This is not so because the truly free man does what he likes, but because he imitates, so far as mortal man can, the flawless and patterned regularity of the heavenly beings. Like them, not doing merely what he likes, but being what he is, being fully human as they are fully divine, and fully human by his likeness to them. For the crown of life is not being mortal to think mortal thoughts, but rather to immortalize as much as possible and by all means to live in accordance to the highest element in oneself. That's Lewis. Aristotle's formulation, equally blunt, suggests the comparison, if not the equation then, of the intellect with the image of God. If intellect is divine, wrote Aristotle, then in comparison with man, life according to the intellect is divine in comparison with human life. We must, said Aristotle, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it be small in bulk, much more does it in power and worth surpass everything. The key point here is that the man with leisure, the man free from life's servile pursuits, must not claim license to follow any pursuit whatsoever. Rather, the good life is the happy life of contemplation directed toward the divine. Now, to be sure, the Greco-Roman conception of the divine was incomplete. There's good reason not to equate the intellect alone with the image of God, Aristotle's unmoved mover, who is self-absorbed in contemplation, constitutes no match for the triune God the apostles confess. It is precisely at this moment, when the fullness of time came, that Christianity entered the drama of Western civilization with redemptive action and secured salvation for mankind and offered redemptive action, sanctification, for the classical artes liberales. We have noted Aristotle's observation that every art and action aims at some good, that the end is desired for its own sake would be the highest good, and that the supreme end toward which all activity is ordered is called happiness. Well, I think Jesus and the apostles noted these things and built upon them. Consider the Sermon on the Mount, which includes the exhortation to perfection. Therefore be ye perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Paul, Peter, and the apostles repeat this requirement that Christians be perfect or holy. On this point, scholars of New Testament Greek note that the word for perfect in the phrase be ye perfect is teleos, which means fully developed in the moral sense, complete, or having attained the end or purpose. It shares the same root with telos, from which we get our word teleology, which is the study of ends, goals, or purposes. In other words, Christ's command to be holy or perfect is the command to be complete, to order one's life toward reaching the highest human end or goal. It is a teleological command to pursue a divinely ordered goal. The command to be perfect is the command to live life as a pilgrimage to this highest good. If Aristotle recognized this highest end as happiness, when he wrote that none of the things that belong to happiness is incomplete, Jesus Christ did not disagree. The same Sermon on the Mount that includes the exhortation to perfection opens, as we know, with the list of Beatitudes, each of which begins with the term happy, as in, happy are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The Beatitudes depicted the character of the person who was happy, notes church historian Robert Louis Wilkin. And in some patristic writers, the string of Beatitudes were seen as steps leading toward that goal of happiness. Further, we must acknowledge as well that the Greek language includes more than one word referring to happiness. One of these, makares, refers to the happiness of the gods, and its derivative, makarios, denotes man's share in the untrammeled happiness of the gods. The other term for happiness, eudaimon or eudaimonia, referred in common speech to the man who has money. So he's happy because he can get what he wants, although it originally referred to the guidance of a man's guardian spirit. This second word for happiness, eudaimonia, eudaimon, they don't appear in the Greek New Testament. The New Testament word for happiness is makarios. And it is interesting that Aristotle employs the same word in the portions of the ethics to which we have been referring. It is a very robust term. The philosopher Joseph Pieper observes that the single word happiness comprehends such a variety of meanings, the immortal richness of divine life and man's part in it, as well as the way some use it for the petty satisfaction of fleeting desires. In short, happiness is the name for the ultimate goal of human life. With these things in mind, a Greco-Roman conception of liberal arts may be described as the activity of the free man at leisure, cultivating his intellect for its own sake through contemplation of the supreme good. Such activity was believed to complete man's unique status as a rational animal, and thereby bear in him its proper fruit, namely happiness. So far, so good, perhaps. But this Hellenic concept did not include sufficient spiritual horsepower to sustain itself over time. The Christian vision, as we have just noted, does not offer happiness as the end of intellectual activity oriented toward an abstract supreme good. Rather, as Augustine taught in Book 10 of the City of God, the foundation of our happiness, the end of our desires, is God. To be sure, Greek thinkers did not object to a conception of the highest good as likeness to God, But Christians affirm the incarnation, the surprising, controversial affirmation that God has become a human person in Jesus Christ, a person who importantly was called teacher by those who knew him and sought what he offered. Hence, for the Christian, likeness to God would imply imitation of Christ and abiding in his word. The 8th chapter of John's Gospel notes that Jesus offered freedom. If you abide in my word, said Jesus, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. According to Christianity, there is an unbreakable connection between knowledge of the truth and freedom. Knowledge of the truth comes through abiding in Christ's word. To abide is to hold to remain with, to dwell upon. In our context, Christ's word becomes the object of contemplation and then the source of our action. The result is freedom. So to clarify, we might then ask, what hath truth to do with freedom? Now, to be sure, this is a little play on the church father Tertullian's famous rhetorical question, which I modified for the title of my remarks. What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem, the church with the academy? Of course, Tertullian's known for answering nothing. But we can't take the bait and answer with him that Jerusalem has nothing to do with Athens. To do so would be to embrace a kind of anti-intellectualism. Rather, truth and freedom have everything to do with each other. Jerusalem has rescued Athens. St. Paul explicitly indicated as much when he visited Athens and spoke to the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers on Mars Hill, when he said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar to this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. And he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel after him and find him. Yet he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not think the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by art and the imagination of man. The times of ignorance of God overlooked, but now he commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and out of this he has given assurance to all men by raising him from the dead. Christianity does not reject classical learning and the liberal arts. It embraces them, and in doing so completes them, sustains them, and gives them their fullest orientation toward the very truth that makes men free and that make the arts liberal. Christianity can do this because it has always affirmed the distinction between liberty and license. The Christian knows that true freedom is not simply to do as you will, wrote Russell Kirk way back in 1956. For the Christian, freedom is the submission of the will to God, and this is no paradox, said Kirk. We are free in proportion as we recognize our true duties and our true limitations. Submit to the will of God, and you will be wise and free under God's ordinance. This was the message of the first psalmist. Happy is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of the sinner. And of course, as we all know, it's really what the opening of Exodus 20 was. I, the Lord your God, am the God who took you out of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me, and so on. These weren't a list of commands to try to take happiness away from people, saying, guess what? You used to be in bondage. You were miserable. Now you're free. This is the way free men live. They have ordered lives. They do these kinds of things. This is a prophetic and descriptive list of how free men ought to live. For the liberal arts to be truly liberal, then, requires that they be limited by a commitment to an objective, knowable truth. And reflecting upon medieval education in the universities, Russell Kirk wrote, "The old schoolmen were free precisely because they believed in an enduring truth exists, and they were the servants of God and that truth only. The modern university, dedicated to religious principle, is freer than a secularized state institution precisely because devout scholars understand in what the dignity of man consists. Man does not dignify himself. Dignity, by definition, is a thing conferred. We enjoy freedom only because freedom has been conferred upon us by divine wisdom. When we deny that sanction for freedom, soon freedom itself becomes only a word, and with it, the dignity of man is forgotten." This orientation toward truth causes liberal arts to thrive. When the philosopher, scholar, or student is consecrated to service of the truth, he strains for the wisdom to be obtained from a teleological search. This search is not a secular and purposeless groping after miscellaneous information, but an activity emerging from the teleological view of existence and a commitment to the religious function of higher learning. Let us be reminded that it was within a culture affirming this religious function of higher education that the first universities were born. Further, it was within a culture affirming this religious function of higher learning that modern science was born. Further still, it was within a culture affirming this religious function of higher learning that the United States of America were born. When the liberal arts are sanctified in a union with Christian faith, they bear remarkable fruit. This includes the intellectual and moral capital that sustains civilizations. Is it any wonder then that in the summer of 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was meeting, the Confederation Congress was carrying out its last business, issuing the Northwest Ordinance, whose third article begins with the phrase, "Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged." Does not this exhortation nicely combine the Aristotelian, the Christian, and the pedagogical threads of our inquiry? This vision of a fruitful union between religion and liberal learning would find expression again and again in American colleges. I work at a small Christian college in Michigan, whose articles of association include the following: "Religious culture in particular shall be conserved by the college, and by the selection of instructors and other practical expedients, it shall be a conspicuous aim to teach by precept and example the essentials of the Christian faith and religion." There's little remarkable in that. Until a few generations, men took it for granted that the essence of true education was religious knowledge. Theology was the queen of the sciences. Professors and teachers, whether Catholic or Protestant, were men of holy orders, or at least schooled in theology, apologetics, biblical studies, and a wealth of Christian thought. These things, once axiomatic to the liberal arts, are increasingly questioned today, however. The questioning comes from two different quarters, each of which in its own way may jeopardize the future of Christianity's partnership with liberal learning. The first sort of suspicion registered by Christians of the most pious stripe, who think they smell a rat in Newman's assertion that knowledge is capable of being its own end. Some of these folks are grounded upon the Westminster Catechism and begin with the phrase, "The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever." When this premise is conjoined with a particular vocational doctrine, sometimes called the Protestant work ethic, Christians come to view all human activity, even the pursuit of liberal learning, as a means to glorifying God. How then, they ask, could knowledge be its own end? Is there not something a bit idolatrous or self-centered in this? This seems a fair question, but I think the very asking of it betrays a misunderstanding of the view I'm urging, that liberal arts are for their own sake, or that knowledge can be its own end. To agree with the assertion that knowledge can be its own end is first to admit the old distinction between the liberal arts and the servile arts that we mentioned earlier. It's to affirm with Joseph Pieper that there do exist human activities that are meaningful without being either work or mere rest from work. It is to grant, in other words, that there is some activity meaningful in itself. Now, to be sure, singing a Te Deum or belting out the doxology, celebrating a feast, or praying the liturgy qualify as this sort of activity. Yet, do these ecclesial activities alone qualify? Are there not other activities meaningful in themselves, despite not being explicitly doxological? Consider Pieper's answer. Whenever, in reflective and receptive contemplation, we touch, even remotely, the core of things, the hidden ultimate reason of the living universe, the divine foundation of all that is, the purest form of all archetypes, whenever and wherever we thus behold the very essence of reality, there is an activity that is meaningful in itself taking place. I submit that genuinely liberal learning fosters this contemplation of reality, which of course leads to an apprehension, be it ever so slight or gradual, of the divine. Our skeptical Christian interlocutor might reply, yes, but doesn't this glorify God? Well, of course it does, even as it is meaningful in itself, even as it will be knowledge of reality pursued for its own sake. Thus, I think the earnest and pious concern that knowledge should always be servile to the glory of God and thus never liberal or for its own sake rests upon a false dichotomy. Liberal learning can be for its own sake, even as it glorifies God. I stated there is a second modern outlook that challenges the future of Christianity's partnership with liberal learning. The first challenge stemmed from the fear some Christians have that knowledge for its own sake would deny God glory. The second is far less noble motivation and perhaps easier to describe. This challenge to Christianity's partnership with liberal learning rests, ironically, on the usefulness and practicality of the enterprise. As I noted earlier, it simply is the case that history repeats the story of the fruitfulness of Christian liberal learning again and again. When pursued for its own sake, in union with Christian faith, liberal learning has produced not just clerics, monks, and poets, but scientists, statesmen, business entrepreneurs. Such products, however, were not specifically intended. As the scholar Marion Montgomery reminded years ago, the trivium and quadrivium were established before the pragmatic advantages of those disciplines appeared. They were developed out of the natural desire of man to know, not because they were immediately practical. In our utilitarian world, teeming with pragmatic worshipers gathered at the shrine of the useful, can genuine Christian liberal learning, the kind that does not begin by asking, what can I do with it? Or from the student, will this be on the test? Can that flourish? For such Christian liberal learning to do so, we must distinguish between, on the one hand, the happy and often useful consequences of liberal education, and on the other, the necessary ends or goals of liberal education. Herein obtains what I often call the paradox of liberal education. Liberal learning produces cultivated, civilized men and women. It produces people capable of continuing to educate themselves, people endowed with the necessary intellectual framework, curiosity, and methods to pursue a life of learning. It produces citizens endowed with the faculties of mind necessary to a free society. And these free people will be scientists, statesmen, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, and others. These are undoubtedly consequences of liberal education, but they are consequences, not the ends or objects. If they become the ends or objects of the liberal arts, if the liberal arts are rendered servile, even if servile to nobler or greater goods outside themselves, these consequences may not result. The liberality of learning will have been lost. In short, the liberal arts must be their own end or subject if our culture hopes to accrue these other consequences and blessings that liberal learning may produce. But make the consequences the object, and they will not be realized. How many colleges and universities, including liberal arts colleges, does U.S. News and World Report rank by what the starting salary will be for a graduate afterwards? Hardly a liberal motivation. This is, I am sure, the greatest of the two challenges, therefore, facing the future of Christianity's partnership with liberal learning. Nearly 2 decades ago, Naomi Schaefer Riley's book, God on the Quad, How Religious Colleges and Missionary Generations Are Changing America, appeared to much fanfare. The volume documented the persistent vitality of religious liberal learning in its many contemporary flavors. Something has changed. The increasingly typical collegiate experience is neither liberal nor Christian. Instead, the most common baccalaureate path has emerged besotted with technical and utilitarian job training and information transferring, interrupted now only by occasional institutionally mandated indoctrination in woke ideology and school-sponsored bread and circuses or rhythmic cycles of mindless Epicurean inebriation induced by the widest range of playthings from video gaming to TikTok to booze. This, however, is the world of Charlotte Simmons, detailed in Tom Wolfe's lurid 2004 novel. Wow, it's almost been 20 years. I will forbear the details. We all know too well that the educational enterprise at post-Christian Leviathan University, which is hyper-athleticized, power-pointed, utilitarian, and remedial, bears little resemblance to that of the pre-20th century Christian liberal arts college. There seems little collective will to change it either. One governor of Michigan earlier this century in her State of the State address urged that greater emphasis be placed upon improving undergraduate education. Her rationale was simply and wholly servile. Why do college degrees matter so much? She asked. This was her answer, quote, one word, paycheck, end quote. Her successor, by the way, is another female governor in the state who has just launched a bid to take over the state initiative in pre-K through 8th grade education with her own agenda. So is my conclusion a defeated bow to utilitarian secularism? Well, George Marsden's big book of 1994, The Soul of the American University, which carries the subtitle, From Protestant Establishment to Established Non-Belief, is well known to historians of higher education. It was followed by his provocatively titled volume, The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. Assuming that Tom Wolfe's fiction and George Marsden's titles reflect accurately the contemporary academic climate, is there any option left to me other than a sigh of pessimistic resignation for my forecast for the future of Christian liberal arts in America? I think not. This is not because I'm an optimist. I confess I am a pessimist. But I think Russell Kirk was onto something when he wrote in 1956 these words, 2-3 generations ago. In this age of grim secular uniformity, boredom, and mechanization, when things are in the saddle and the triumph of technology threatens to suppress the truly human person, we require intellectual power and virtue more than ever before. Optimism and pessimism are moods. Hope is a virtue, a Christian virtue. While I'm pessimistic, I remain hopeful. My hope for the survival of a persistent and fruitful engagement of Christianity and liberal learning rests upon at least two things. First, it rests upon the historical fact that liberal arts learning has always been marginalized by servile concerns. We work, we plow, we sow, we harvest, we dig, we labor, we sweat, that we may have leisure. The servile always has and always will claim priority of place as long as we live in the flesh. Genuine liberal learning of the type I have described always has been the exception to the servile rule of human living and learning. Remind you of Genesis 3. That contemporary higher education conforms to this fact should surprise no one. It would take a denial of our embodied sinful human condition to cease to ask the practical question, what can I do with it? So as much as I prefer a liberal to a servile education, that preference affords no brief for fist shaking at my utilitarian world. Finally, however, my hope rests on the fact that truth has beauty and power. Newman put it quite nicely in his 9th discourse of the idea of a university. Truth, he wrote, has two attributes: beauty and power. While useful knowledge is the possession of truth as powerful, liberal knowledge is the apprehension of truth as beautiful. Pursue it either as beauty or power, to its furthest extent, to its true limit, and you are led by either road to the eternal and infinite, to the intimations of conscience and the announcements of the church. If Aristotle was correct in his opening assertion of the metaphysics, that all men by nature desire to know, I will only add that that which they desire to know most is the truth, in both its beauty and power. I open with the proposition that Christianity is that truth. As long as men want to know the truth and continue to carve out for themselves the leisure to pursue it, however small that leisure space may be, and however meager their efforts at pursuing truth, a living engagement between Christianity and the liberal arts will persist. Thank you.